Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Concordia Live. My name is Joe Milbank, one of Concordia's programming associates, and I'm so pleased to have you all here with us today. A special thank you to our global patron member CARE for organizing today's important discussion. Today, nearly 3 billion people have never used the internet. The cost of this gap to society and the economy is tremendous and disproportionately borne by women and girls. Closing the gender digital divide alone would generate an estimated $524 billion in economic activity by 2025. During today's Concordia Live, we will hear from CARE, Mastercard, and GSMA on their work to close the gender digital divide, promote women's economic empowerment, energize the digital economy, and pursue that growth. A few quick housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees are automatically muted upon entry, but we hope that you'll take advantage of the chat feature to introduce yourself, react to comments in the discussion, and engage throughout the conversation. To ask a question, please utilize this same chat function at the bottom of your screen. We will be answering questions later in the webinar. Lastly, this webinar will be recorded and available on Concordia's webpage and YouTube channel. Now, without further ado, I am honored to introduce today's moderator, Christian Pennotti. Christian is a senior director at CARE and currently serves as the managing director for the Women in the Digital Economy Fund, or WIDEF, a $60 million initiative of USAID and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. A global leader with a 20-year track record, Christian has extensive experience defining strategy and building programs, teams, and partnerships to deliver lasting economic change. Christian, over to you.
Thanks so much, Joe, and thank you to everyone who's joining us from around the world. It's great to see folks coming in, and we know in a midsummer's conversation, it's sometimes hard to carve out space and time for these discussions, but I'm incredibly excited to have the opportunity today to represent CARE and share a little bit about what we're working on, but more so to hear from the incredible group of panelists that have agreed to join us today. So as Joe mentioned, I am a senior director at CARE, and I currently have the privilege of leading a global initiative focused on closing the gender digital divide called the Women in the Digital Economy Fund. This is a joint effort with USAID and the Gates Foundation, as well as GSMA and colleagues at Global Digital Inclusion Partnership, working to meaningfully close the gender digital divide in the years ahead. I've also had the privilege of getting to work very closely with Claire in that capacity, as well as with Payal Dalal, who joins us from Mastercard and is a vice president of global programs. We're grateful that Payal helps guide some of CARE's own strategy around private sector engagement and corporate collaboration, and have worked extensively for years with her and her team at the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth on helping growth-oriented women-led businesses to thrive. So she'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about that as we dive into this. Claire Sibthorpe is the head of digital inclusion in the Mobile for Development team at GSMA. She's also my counterpart and collaborator on the Women in the Digital Economy Fund. So very grateful to her for making the time to join us today and talk about GSMA's work in this space and some of the incredible work and analytics that her team has been driving and sharing with everyone. And Hela Gharbi joins us from Rwanda. She's proudly CARE's own country director for Rwanda, and her team is doing incredible things across a whole spectrum of issues related to gender inequality in the country. And so I'm grateful that she's able to join us and talk about how her team's approaching that and really how some of this looks perspective of the women and girls that they're working with every day. As Joe mentioned, in terms of today's theme, obviously there is, in a world in which AI and blockchain technology and all of these advanced technologies are at the front of everybody's feed every day, we see tremendous opportunity, but we also see the incredible risks that exist both in perpetuating divides that we see offline in terms of access to opportunity, and in growing, in many places, digital divides in terms of the opportunities that women and girls have compared to men and boys in their societies. There is a tremendous role for everyone to play in closing that gap. And as Joe mentioned, there's a significant economic opportunity. So looking at how we can partner with the private sector, how the private sector can draw on evidence or insights that might be coming out of the nonprofit space and scale those up, and what questions the private sector has are some of our ambitions through conversations like this. So with that, I'll just again say we're grateful folks are here. We look forward to the conversation. And Claire, if I could, I'd love to open up that conversation by turning to you and maybe hearing a little bit more about the work that you're doing, and in particular, some of what you've seen in your recently released Mobile Gender Gap Report, and what do the trends look like in terms of access, and are we making progress?
Great, and thanks for having me here. Other than sort of the WIDEF initiative you mentioned, I lead our Connected Women program, which focuses on accelerating digital and financial inclusion for women in low middle income countries. And we kind of do sort of three broad things. We do a lot of research and data collection on this issue. We support our mobile operator members and partners to help realize this opportunity, and sort of work with governments as well. So in terms of like where we stand now, which I think was your question, so we've been measuring, so we look specifically at mobile. So mobile is the primary way that most people access the internet, particularly women. So we measure, what does that look like? And we saw that there had been quite a significant, it's a big gap, but it had been reducing. So it reduced from women being 25% less likely to use mobile internet in 2017. It went down to 15% in 2020. So that was like, it was looking like at least it was in a positive trend. Then suddenly, in the wake of COVID and after lockdowns ended and sort of economic impacts sort of went through the world, we saw that this was, not unsurprising, I guess, negatively disproportionately impacting on women. So we saw the gender gap, women's rates of digital inclusion slowed. The gender gap also, wasn't going in the right direction. So that wasn't good. But this year in our new data, we're seeing that there's been progress as women's rates have increased a bit compared to men, and the gender gap has gone back to 15%, the mobile internet gender gap. So we're back to where we were in 2020. It's a bit concerning because we don't know if this progress is going to continue to go in the positive direction. We saw after COVID that it is fragile and that there's no guarantee it's going to keep going in the positive direction. And I think it's also important to highlight that this sort of number that I'm saying, which is for low and middle income countries, masks bigger sort of more regional and national inequality. So if you look at the number of women who are not connected, 60% live in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And they have the biggest gender gap. So for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, women are 32% less likely to use mobile internet. In South Asia, it's 31%. So again, it's important to look at that. So we also look at why, like what's causing these gender gaps. And what we're seeing is in terms of there's two very big barriers that are preventing women from, particularly big barriers, preventing women from using mobile internet. That's sort of affordability of handsets and sort of literacy and digital skills. There's other barriers around relevance, safety and security, and other access related, but those sort of come out as very strong barriers when we ask women, what's stopping you? And I think it's also important to flag, and I'll end here, but is that it's not just about being able to use the internet. It's about also being able to use it, to meet life needs. And when we look at the data, we see again that there's fewer women are using the internet for a less diverse range of use cases than men. So even when they go online, there's also some challenges around being able to use it to the same extent as men. So so that's where we stand. It's slightly better news this year than last year, and let's cross our fingers that we'll continue in this direction.
Thanks, Claire, so much for the highlights. And I know we'll want to come back and dig into that a little bit more. Also, I'll just flag for those who are in the room, please do feel free to put comments in the chat or questions in the chat as we go. We'll try to pick those up as we go. And if we don't, we definitely have some time on the back end of some of the structured conversation to dig into that. But definitely want to hear what's front of mind for all of you. Building on some of Claire's big picture framing in terms of, okay, so some good news, right? We thought we were going in a negative direction. There was a lot of energy and sort of urgency generated around that, and great to know we're trending back in a positive direction, even if we've taken a few steps back. Payal, you and your team work on so many things. And so I won't even try to reflect that. Global programs is precisely what you're talking about. But I know we've had the chance to work in particular on supporting growth-oriented women-led businesses around the world, and would love to hear a little bit more about that work and what do you see that's working, and maybe what are some of the challenges that your team's really focused on at the moment?
Absolutely. And maybe I can start with just maybe a couple of macro statements that help explain our positioning and our approach and some of our hypotheses. And I think the first one is that the end goal isn't digitalization, it's how digital can be used as an enabler. And so, how digital can be powerful when it comes to the outcomes we're looking for, when it comes to women's agency, women's empowerment, women's resilience, women's financial health. And, the corollary I always think about is the financial inclusion ecosystem, where we were so focused on access. But to Claire's point, how do we get even more focused on usage and capability and trust? And so that's the first point I want to make here, is that digital is important, but the end goal isn't digital. It's how digital actually helps us achieve the outcomes we want. And so when we're thinking about inclusion, we're adding this layer to inclusion around inclusive digitalization, because we know that the world is increasingly digital. And so when we're thinking about small and help their resilience and get them back on the path to growth, we think about is help women entrepreneurs digitalize their operations, access and harness the power of digital financial services, and really leverage digital platforms, all in service of helping women, small businesses save time and make money. So that's kind of the framing, Christian, of what we're trying to do and why. It's not that we just want somebody to digitalize their inventory management system for the sake of it, right? How is that actually going to help the women's business, but also her family and her community? So you mentioned that we have been working on the kind of small business and the women's small business space for a long time. And we're celebrating our 10-year anniversary this year. And we've worked with millions of small businesses. Our Strive program alone, that we are proudly partnering with CARE on, has worked with over 11 million small businesses since 2021. So the scale and the breadth is quite impressive, and Strive is active in over 20 countries. And maybe I'll just share 3 lessons that kind of have surfaced over the 10 years of work. The first, and this really comes from our partnership with CARE that started in 2019, is that when you're thinking about digital financial services, you have to take a human-centered design approach. And actually, it's not even a human-centered design approach. This is I would like to give credit to CARE for coining the phrase women-centered design. How do we actually get really intentional about the needs of women? And so I think about a couple of the things that we did together, Christian, around helping unlock access to finance and capital for women entrepreneurs in Pakistan. Because of kind of the institutional barriers that women in Pakistan face, they didn't have traditional forms of collateral. And so we worked with UBank and CARE to figure out, based on what women entrepreneurs in Pakistan have, what are the alternative forms of collateral? And we landed on gold jewelry. And all of a sudden, there were so many more women entrepreneurs that were able to lend against, or be able to borrow against that gold jewelry. So the first lesson is really, how are you intentional about designing digital financial service products? And how are you kind of oriented around the needs of women entrepreneurs specifically? The second, I think, is really around how we go where women entrepreneurs already are. We can't make women entrepreneurs work or try to find us. So how do we leverage channels that they're already using, whether that's WhatsApp, whether it's some large digital platforms they might already be participating on? So for the work that we did together in Peru, we leveraged the WhatsApp networks that had already been created, because we knew that women were on WhatsApp all the time. We didn't want to have them try to search for us, Google or find us, a website somewhere random, but rather go where they already were and make it easy for them to leverage the resources that we were bringing to bear. And then the third thing, which I think is incredibly important and not talked about enough, is when we're thinking about digital inclusion, we have to think about that blend of touch and tech. You can't go from 100% analog to 100% digital. There's a journey there, and it's all about enabling trust. And that trust is often enabled by some sort of element of touch. We worked with Action in Indonesia with women entrepreneurs. We had built a platform to help them access credit. And we were finding that women entrepreneurs weren't leveraging that platform because they didn't know what it was, and they didn't trust what it was. And so we added on a layer of field officers that had a long-standing history with that community of women entrepreneurs. They had personal relationships with those customers. And within 2 months of that platform not being used at all, and to that kind of touch element being introduced, we had 30,000 users and were able to unlock access to credit to 30,000 immediately. So those are just a few of the lessons that have come up as we think about what we need to do to be gender intentional when it comes to inclusive digitalization.
Awesome, Payal. Thanks so much. There's so much to unpack in there, and we're definitely gonna pick up some of it, but also come back to some of it. And in my intro for Payal, I didn't mention 10 million entrepreneurs, which was the last number I had, and it's good that I didn't, because the number's gone up. So just huge excitement to see that kind of investment, and appreciate that. Hela, we'd love to come to you, and obviously I think some of the examples Payal is sharing of specific interventions or specific lessons they've drawn. I'd really appreciate if you can share with everyone sort of the perspective from Care Rwanda, the kinds of things maybe generally that your team's working on, because I think, at least as I've come more and more into this work, Payal, to your point of digital as an enabler, it's not necessarily the goal, right? And so from Care's standpoint, that's been our journey, right? Supporting gender equality, supporting justice and access to opportunity has been the mission. Helping people get online and be able to use these tools effectively has become a component of what it takes for that to happen. But Hela, obviously you're living this every day. You've got an amazing team. Maybe you can talk a bit about the work you're doing in Rwanda, and what do you see from your perspective in terms of the women and girls you work with? And, does digital inclusion resonate with them? Is this an ambition? Is this, what progress are you seeing? What does this look like a little bit through their eyes?
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here and to share the Rwanda experience, just to give a bit of flavor what's happening really when we talk about sub-Saharan Africa and data and what is hiding behind those numbers. And I think Rwanda is a great example to really dive into. So I was thinking maybe of starting with a story. I think it's the best way of doing this. So I want to tell you about the story of a lady called Christine that I've had the opportunity to meet with. That was a couple of months ago during a closeout of a project that we have that's going on the ground. So who is Christine? Christine is the lady who has been enrolled, who enrolled in a village saving and loan association. She lives in a very small village in the southern province of Rwanda, in a district called Nyanza. And she has learned how to save money within that group. She has learned also how to borrow money, and she started, growing little by little into that group. So increasing her share, et cetera, building trust also with her other fellows. So it's a group of about 25 people, and they all work together, and they all come together, and they decide to save together and accept loans to members of the group. So Christine, she also benefited from the opportunity of enrolling in another project where we've selected a number of VSLAs in the southern province, including Nyanza and her VSLA in particular, so that they can enroll in what we call the digital care package journey. What is the digital care package? It's a program that we piloted in 3 districts together with the team Care USA, and Christian was one of the crafters together with us. So we're very proud to have him on this in this position as the moderator. So what happened to her? She didn't have a phone. She was like, me having a phone, that doesn't work. I'm just a woman. I cannot have a phone. So little by little, as she got into this program, she had access to a device. So she bought a device that she was paying out through installments. And then she started using that device together also with her partner. And her partner, at first, he was always seeing her using her phone, and he was very suspicious, thinking, what is she doing with her phone? When she was getting SMSs in the middle of the night, he was like, is she cheating on me? And it actually got them to have very difficult conversations. But little by little, given that also her partner was part of the group and also having these conversations, he started understanding a little bit more what she was doing with her phone. So aside from that, she used her phone to start navigating a bit the internet. And one of the platforms that she loved was YouTube. That was absolutely revolutionary for her. So she went on YouTube and she was saying that she loved cooking. So she wanted to prepare something for her kids. She was looking for cooking tips. And then she had this video on how to produce or how to cook tofu. And that's how she created tofu. And so she thought, okay, this is amazing. I think I'm going to start a business on tofu. So I was very happy because I'm a vegetarian, and I told her, fantastic, I will be your first client if you do that. So this is just for you to have an idea on where they start and where they go, and how this kind of platform can be transformational for them. So having access to a number of possibilities in terms of starting a business, connecting with others, I don't know, having an email address, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a success story, I would say. But who are the women that we are working with? The women that we are working with, and men, because we work with both, even though we are focused, more intentionally on women because we're a gender justice organization. These women are extremely poor to start with. They don't have any source of income to start with. And that's why we always start with a financial inclusion and financial literacy training, which we believe is what is going to give them this level of confidence that they need, so that they can then have a number of dreams that could come true. They can have a voice, they can feel a bit more confident, they can even overcome conflicts in their families. So these women also face GBV or intimate partner violence, or any form of oppression or abuse within their communities, because of the fact that they lack agency, they lack voice, they lack confidence. So this is one of the reasons why we also focus a lot on GBV programming, because we know that the women that we are working with are more prone to be abused. These women are also, for some of them, for quite a chunk of them, illiterate. So they don't know how to read, write, and count. That's also a challenge when we think about digital inclusion. So if we're thinking about digital literacy, what happens if this woman is not literate? So how can we adapt the technology itself, the device, and also the content for them to be able to navigate this world of possibilities, which is the internet? Some of them are also suffering from disabilities. So many of them are also survivors from the genocide, or they've undergone trauma, or they have mental health challenges, and so on and so forth. So these are the women that we work with. They're in urban settings, in rural settings, in refugee camps, a little bit everywhere. And we've seen that with this program that we've initiated, that there has been some change. And the reason why there has been some change is because this program also has a very strong social norms component. The social norms component is essential. Even though we look at the numbers in Rwanda that are absolutely extraordinary, that we've spoken about earlier with Payal, we know that the devil is in the details, and there is so much to say in terms of patriarchy and the fact that, unfortunately, women until now feel that they have no right to own a phone. It's not possible because they are women. And those are the women that we are working with every day. And we engage men also to try to bring them on board so that they can be champions and supporters for their partners. I don't know if I've taken too much time, Christian, because I know maybe we would like to.
I think no, I think it's Hela, I so appreciate you bringing like that human component and that journey to all of this, because I think, I'm just, as I take notes, right? Confidence, trust, dreams, voice. Oftentimes in the digital inclusion conversation, we talk about access, affordability, skills, right? And it's sort of like a little bit to Payal's point, as well about, it's not about the mechanics of, I think one of the things we consistently look at is the gender digital divide is not a technology problem. By and large, the gender digital divide is by and large a social problem. And it perpetuates a lot of things that happen in the offline world. It exacerbates many of them. It creates new risks. but it also creates tremendous opportunity. And like, I just love the reality of that story. And I actually hadn't heard that whole story yet. So it's always nice when you get to work early on kind of like thinking with a team, and then they do this amazing thing, and you're like, so just grateful for that. I do want to come back to Claire a bit, and I would say, okay, so everyone's put a ton of stuff in the room. So for all of you, like, if there's things that you're like, I really want to talk about this bit, please. There's no like super pre-canned script. But I do think, given the context and being here with Concordia, Claire, how does the private sector, what are the roles that you see where the private sector and maybe GSMA's members in particular are really finding ways to grapple with some of these issues and some of these realities that you've raised and Hela and Payal have raised? What are good opportunities and things that other companies and businesses can really be thinking about? Because there's just so much wrapped up in some of what Hela just voiced over.
Sure. And before I respond to that, I just want to echo what we heard. I mean, it's absolutely like these inequalities are due to like structural inequalities and social norms. So we actually did some analysis of our data a few years ago where we looked at if like men and women had the same level of income and education, some of these factors, would there still be a mobile gender gap? And the answer is yes. And that's because of, probably these discrimination or social norms that we're talking about. So it's not just, so there's a lot of factors at play. So everything that's been said has resonated. In terms of what the private sector is doing, so I'll just give an example of the kind of things that's happening. In 2016, we launched something called the Connected Women Commitment Initiative, where mobile operators made formal commitments to reduce the gender gap in their mobile internet and mobile money customer base. So they looked at baseline set targets for it. And since then, they've reached over sort of 70 million additional women. And I think the learnings from this is that, first, it's the absolute importance of like having a gender intentional focus has been said, and having targets. And I think this applies not just to private sector, but in general, having a clear gender focus in your strategies and plans with clear targets and having a gender intentional approach is critically, is very important. Understanding not just, the data, like the sort of data I was saying around, what is the state of play in your country in terms of, the scale of the gap, but also what are the needs and the barriers of the woman that you're trying to reach. So like really having an, informed, approach to what you're doing. And then tackling the barriers that women face, not just the barriers, their needs, their circumstances, and tackling and doing it in a holistic way. So, I mentioned there was a couple of barriers that stand out very strongly at the sort of in terms of adoption, but where we see big progress is where somebody might be taking a lead, let's say on a handset affordability initiative or skills, that might be the lead focus of what they're doing, but they're doing it holistically. They're thinking about, all the different barriers that women face, and having that kind of holistic approach can make a real difference. I mean, obviously addressing the individual barriers also makes a difference, but looking at that holistically. And then the other thing I would say is, working in partnership with others. A lot of our members have lots of partnerships with different players and stakeholders. There's no one stakeholder who can address this. And I think also what we see with our data and our work is it's not going to close on its own, this gap. It needs intentional, informed, targeted action. It needs everybody working together. So this idea that, it will just by default over time close, I think is not correct. So we need to be working together. And I think when you kind of do all these things, and I think the private sector through for our mobile operator partners, for example, just as an example, the Connect Women Initiative is, they're showing that it is possible, even in the context where the gender gap was, increasing or stalled, we're able to make positive differences by kind of looking at it in this way. And it's for them, it's not just, doesn't deliver a huge benefit for women. It's also a huge business opportunity. These are customers that they're missing. We sized it, but in over an 8-year period, so sort of, closing the gap in mobile ownership and mobile internet is mobile ownership and use would give the mobile industry $230 billion in additional revenue over 8 years. So this is it's a win in so many ways. It's a win for women, their communities. It's been for businesses, for economies. So yeah, so I think I hope that answers your question in terms of what some of our partners, private sector partners, are doing and what people can do.
Thanks for that, Claire. And maybe just before we come back, I'm going to come back to you, Payal, with, I'm sure, very, very difficult questions. So get ready. But maybe, Claire, if there's one example of a partnership that you've worked on, or one partner, and if we're not going to call out anybody, that's fine. But if there's something that you really feel like, it's a success that you and your team are proud of, that you hold up, I'd love to just hear, a bit of an example and what it is you think that made that successful that others might be able to pick up on.
Sure. I mean, so I'll give some examples. A lot of our members are working, let's say, in a handset affordability initiatives. That's a topic that's going, but they're doing it. They're doing financing for women, or not just women, but trying to target women for people who can't afford a phone. They can pay in installments or get some financing to do that. But they're not just doing that. They're actually, when they distribute the phones, they're doing training on how to use it. They're doing awareness raising of the benefits, because a lot of people don't always know, why a phone, how it could help with them with their lives, or how the internet could help. So awareness raising, training, making sure there's relevant content that's also on that phone that's relevant to the needs of the woman that they're trying to target. So again, so it's and doing it, in partnership with handset vendors, some of the OTT players, maybe sometimes the government, or women's, like, for example, savings groups and self-help groups, and those sort of types of partners that they're having. But I think it's when they're really like thinking about all these different barriers and then partnering with local organizations or government, or maybe even like radio stations or different providers in the ecosystem that can kind of help to sort of drive action against the different barriers.
Thanks so much for that, Claire. And similarly, Payal, so much in the room, pick up on anything, right? Things that resonate, things that reinforce, but also perhaps where Mastercard, if you've seen different things, please do jump in, and we want to hear that. I also am thinking, the data is out there, right? It's known that there's this big economic opportunity. It's known that this is a big problem. The ITU, the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals, everyone kind of acknowledges digital is an enabler. And yet, here we are, making progress, but still facing some challenges. So I'm curious, from Mastercard's perspective, or your perspective, what are some of the opportunities for shifts in terms of how the problem's being approached, or the role the private sector or others might play in kind of accelerating, right? And making us all feel really confident that we're going to get there.
Terrific. Lots of questions at once. Thanks, Christian. So maybe we can start where Claire left off, which was some concrete examples of partnerships that worked. And I want to hone in on a couple of phrases that both Claire and Hela mentioned. One was around social norms, and one was kind of the need to be holistic. So let me try to give you an example in each of those kind of categories. One is around social norms. And I think it's so incredibly important, Christian, to your point, that we include this in the dialogue when we talk about inclusive digitalization. One of the things that we do with a coalition called RISE, and CARE is a member, as is BSR, the ILO, and GAP, is we're working to digitalize the wages of garment workers who are 85% women in supply chains. Hypothesis being that there are lots of challenges to being paid in cash. And by digitalizing wages, it becomes an accelerated way to get a large number of workers into digital financial services and into the digital economy. So we have been working on digitalizing wages since 2018 with a number of apparel brands, factory owners, workers' rights groups. And what we learned very early on is you can't just enable the digitalization of wages and then everything's great, right? You can't just go straight from cash to digital and everything works. One, it's, of course, you need that blend of touch and tech to get to that trust piece. But two, what we notice is when you go straight from cash to digital, you're not bringing the rest of the ecosystem, the local communities, the local families with you on the journey. And so what we often saw was that gender-based violence went up, because often in garment work, women workers are expected to hand over their cash wages to the men in their family. And so when they went from a cash wage to a digital wage, they weren't able to easily do that. And so what we realized is that while we were enabling positive externalities, there were a lot of negative. And so we ended up having to layer on work around gender-based violence. And so it ended up being the need for community engagement with the men in the family. Why is it good that, you know, the wife, the daughter, the sister keeps hold of her financial assets? Why is it in their interest? And so we did a lot of community engagement, family engagement, and we also did, again, to try to help shift some of these social and cultural norms, we also created a number of kind of small bite-sized soap operas where we changed gender roles, where you saw men in the family doing dishwashing to try to spur a conversation about, do we really need to do things the way they've always been done? Or is there an opportunity to improve everyone's outcomes by changing things up? So that was one point around kind of looking at social norms and just, again, being mindful that the digital journey isn't necessarily going to be smooth. And there are going to be unique challenges and barriers that women face, and there might be consequence. And so how do you mitigate for those so that it's net positive and that we're not doing any harm? So that's one around social norms. Around the holistic piece that Claire was talking about, one of the things that I have been kind of on a hobby horse about is the need to think about childcare within the world of women's economic empowerment. I was just this week in fact, just this morning in Romania, where we had set up a jobs placement program for displaced Ukrainian women in Romania. And what we recognized very quickly was that these women they absolutely had to find jobs. But how could they do that when they had children to take care of and they didn't have the support networks because they had been displaced by the war? And so we ended up not only doing the job skilling CV, employment matching and job matching, we ended up also setting up a childcare center so that the women could drop their children off and then do the interviewing or indeed the working that they needed to do. And so thinking holistically about, it's not just the barrier or the language that's going to be the hurdle to their economic livelihoods. Actually, it might be these other institutional things, or it might be that they just need somebody to help with childcare. And so that is very fresh on my mind since I visited it yesterday. We did something similar in Poland with women entrepreneurs where we helped displaced Ukrainian women entrepreneurs set up and reestablish their businesses in Poland. And again, because they didn't have the family support units and the societal support units from their friends, they needed help with childcare. And of course, Christian, this is something you and I are working on within our Strive Women program, really trying to interrogate if you add a childcare component into kind of a value-added service for a women entrepreneur, does the financial health of their small business increase? My hypothesis will be yes, but I think it's going to be a really interesting area. So a couple of concrete examples, and then to your question around what do we need to do to really accelerate change. I think from a private sector perspective, Christian, it's about how do you enable commercially sustainable social impact? So how do you layer on gender equity and inclusive digitalization into business models? Because ultimately, to Claire's point, it is good for business. And so how do you not just have it sit in the philanthropy world of the corporate, but how is it really mainstreamed? So, one good example of how it's mainstream for us, all of employees, our bonus, we have an ESG compensation modifier. So depending on how we're doing on ESG and the one of the metrics is women's pay parity, for example, right? So that really motivates everyone in the company to ensure that not only do we have diverse slates of candidates, that there's equal representation of men and women at all levels, but actually that there's pay parity as well. So I think it's really about how do we think creatively about mainstreaming and really kind of creating that commercial incentive in addition to talking about the social imperative.
See, no problem. Tons of questions all at once. I'm so grateful for so much of that, Payal. And also for just, and kudos to Mastercard, right, for finding the right incentive structures that can also be such a big piece of this. And I think that internal institutional change is, the example you shared from Pakistan, some of that thing is around how ready was that institution to make some of those choices, right? Hela, yeah, really curious what you're thinking about some of what our peers here and colleagues are saying.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting insights. I wasn't expecting having a conversation this deep around social norms. I'm very happy that with Mastercard and with GSMA, this is really something that is very much on top of everyone's minds when we think about digitalization related challenges. I think, well, everything resonates with what we're thinking, because currently we are reaching around 1 million people in Rwanda with our programs, and all of them are part of saving groups, all of them. 80% of those are women. And what we've started doing a while ago was to try to digitize the groups. And the reason why we wanted to do that is because we wanted to tie them to financial institutions, because we knew that they would be limited in their growth if they were just relying on the capital that they had within that group. So that's the reason why we started thinking about digitalization at first. And we've started having these conversations with the private sector, and specifically financial service providers, seeing with them whether, if they are digitized, if their operations are digitized and they can have access to their credit history through a platform, would they be eligible for a loan, for example? And we've realized that it takes a lot more time to get them to be on board as private sector, because they also have their commercial imperative. Of course, we don't really have the same business modeling. And also to the point of Payal, yes, we need to have the social imperative as well as this commercial drive. Otherwise, we can't have a sustainable business. So this is something that we're trying to test even today, as we are embarking in some programs where we have teamed up also with private sector, and specifically with MFIs on some of our programs that are targeting entrepreneurs in specific ag value chains, for example. So we're starting to make a little bit of progress on that. But when we really focus on how we are also co-creating programs with the private sector, I think we have a very good example. We've very recently embarked in a journey with a social enterprise called Baobab Circle. They're Kenyan-based. They had an app called Afi app that they were using in the healthcare sector. And we've adapted that application that they were known for, that they had created, it's their own property, to actually digitize a training content on intimate partner violence that we were rolling out on couples that were selected for that program. Usually these are programs that we have that are in person, but we've tried to see whether if we integrate the digital component, we could actually reach this kind of objective, which is to really address critical and harmful social norms through a digital it's an assumption that we had made at the time, because we were in the middle of a pandemic. We couldn't reach the people that we wanted to reach. We couldn't bring them together to sit in a class. We couldn't also, once it was over, we couldn't bring them to attend classes because it was too expensive for them. They didn't have time. They were busy on their farms. So we needed to find a way. We needed to co-create a solution with the private sector. And that's how we had this whole human-centered design workshop that we organized, and we brought in directly the people that we wanted to work with. So the program participants were really even physically at the center of the room. And they were the ones that we were trying to test with them, how they felt going about these types of conversations if they had a phone instead of having a facilitator or a person that they could see, that they could interact with, especially that these are very tough conversations and that they need to be supported. So on the challenging social norms through digital means is something that we are still trying to address, and I think could be really helpful when we're trying to work with companies, may they be MNOs that are currently distributing phones or that are rolling out programs such as Mache Mache, which enables people to buy phones with installments. So having this possibility of accessing a phone very quickly, that they think also about the fact that there are very severe, harmful social norms that can come out once someone owns a device. And that is usually something that we don't really look into with the private sector. It's not something that we can convince them of, because there are also KPIs. The government of Rwanda is extremely ambitious. They would want to, by 2030, have a full cashless economy. So now we're thinking about how we can accelerate digital financial services and how they can reach people very quickly. So we're really running to get that done, but we're not really taking the time to look at the underlying issues that come with that. So we're trying to plug in there, as we have these 1,880,000 people that are part of the groups that we want to get to the banks, that we want to get them to use their phones so that they can accelerate their business growth and everything. But the pace is way too fast for us as an NGO. We need to team up with MNOs, for example. Think about the cost of accessing services like internet, for example. It's expensive. It's expensive for these people to have internet bundles. We need to think about a way of maybe also waiving some fees for them so that they can easily embark. In any case, it's a business model issue, but there are huge clients also that can pay maybe higher fees. So thinking about how we can co-create these kinds of solutions also with MNOs would be really helpful, the same way as we're doing it with financial service providers. I think these are the kind of reactions that come to my mind while I've been listening to Claire and Payal, but I feel like we're all on the same page, and let's work together tomorrow.
It's a deal, Hela. I want to jump in because there was something you said that I have a second hobby horse that I'd like to get on after childcare, and that's that we don't talk about the dark sides of digitalization enough. And there are two that are really top of mind for me right now. The first is cybersecurity. As we have gone into an increasingly digital world, the number of cyber attacks on vulnerable populations and underserved populations, especially women, are on the rise. And our programs, our partnerships, we're so excited and bullish about digitalization, as we should be. I don't think we're doing enough to prepare folks for the risks. And so I think we've just got to do more around bolstering the cybersecurity of small businesses and underserved women, because there is a real dark side here. And I have met so many women entrepreneurs who clicked on a phishing link. All of their customer data was stolen. I have met women who were their data or their customer data was held ransom, and they were asked for large amounts of money. And most, I don't have the exact statistic on my tongue, but I think it's something like it's 50+% of small businesses who experience a cyber attack don't survive. So this is existential. And we're just not talking about this at all. So that's one thing that we need to think about when we think about the dark side of digitalization. The other thing we haven't talked about, so if there's a prize, I'm going to win it for talking about Gen AI. And that is that as these emerging technologies are coming, we're not thinking about the data sets that they're based on and how they might be perpetuating institutional sexism. And there was a question I think I saw in the chat around, how do we make sure that that bias isn't coded into this new technology because of who was actually doing the coding. And I think this is something that we've got to get louder on when we're talking about Gen AI. I am optimistic about Gen AI, but I also think that if we're not careful, we're going to let something out of the box that's just going to put gender equality back. And I'll kind of close with an example. We partnered with Women's World Banking through a data.org challenge a couple of years ago. And the exam question was, is there bias in the algorithms that are approving loans? And so we looked at lending algorithms in Mexico, India, Nigeria. And we compared the outcomes of those lending decisions to what would have happened had it been a loan officer. And women entrepreneurs were turned away more by the lending algorithm. And it's because garbage in, garbage out, right? If your data set isn't gender inclusive, you are not going to have good outcomes. And so, I don't want us to end on a kind of negative note, but I do think as we're talking about all of the opportunities and imperatives around digitalization, we have to just think about some of the risks and how we're being intentional about addressing those and mitigating those at the beginning of these digital journeys. I'll get off my hobby horse now, Christian.
No, it's great, Payal. Yeah, we're gonna ask Claire how we're gonna solve all of that. So I know she's got this all figured out. GSMA is on top of it. They've looked at the problem. They're like, here's how it's gonna work. It's gonna be no problem. Sadly, I know that's not the case. But I do, there's a quote recently from Doreen Bogdan-Martin, who runs the ITU at the UN. And it was that the future of AI is not yet written. The future of AI is not yet written. And so certainly we can't have this conversation today without at least talking a bit about Gen AI. And I think all of us would kind of point to some of the risks. And I personally would just, emphasize, I think the focus on gender-based violence, as Hela can speak to, and others can in the audience, et cetera, offline, and reasons people don't advance on this journey that have nothing to do with some of these factors around access, affordability, in many instances, and then online. I think it's something that everyone would recognize is critical and perhaps significantly probably under prioritized. Claire, we're going to try to do a couple things. So we've got give or take 9 minutes. So we'll all be conscious of time. We want everybody to get onto their next things. But there was one question around, a lot of apps historically might not have been designed gender intentionally, and therefore that's part of the relevance issue. And are you seeing any positive progress in that direction or examples you'd point to? And also I would just maybe in the same breath say, key reflections or takeaways that you might have based on this conversation. Would love to hear those.
Sure. And I completely agree on by the way, before I answer the other question you actually asked me, the point about safety and security. I mean, this is a big barrier that we're seeing. And when we ask people the barriers to using the internet, but then the barriers once they're online to further use, and once they're online, that barrier just also significantly increases. And it's significant under research. In fact, we're currently doing some further research on this topic to try and collate everything that's out there, because we collect data, but it's under researched and under looked at, and it's as people get online, it's just going to become worse. And I think AI and some of these things have a potential to make it even worse. So it is a worry, and it has to be I think a strong consideration of how do we kind of help mitigate. I mean, there's these issues that face people offline as well as online. So it's just that technology is another tool for which existing sort of behaviors play out. But yeah, on the kind of app side, 100% agree that, unfortunately, as was mentioned with biases around data, there's also biases around who's creating and doing this work, and there's just not enough women. And I think, so what we're seeing is there does seem to be a recognition of this and a shift to be, to really take a user-centered design approach and really include women, as I think has been highlighted, that, if you can't, it's not about designing for people, it's designing with people. So people with disabilities, women, they absolutely need to be part of the sort of design and also implementation. So not just the design of these apps, but if you're looking at how do you get to the training out and some of these things, you need women in, delivering that as well. It's more, socially acceptable. It can be challenging for women to go to places where it's all very male dominated. So I think it's so I think that's the answer, is really just having this sort of user-centered design with women, included and at the center of that is absolutely important. I think there's, from what I'm seeing that there seems to be an increasing recognition of that and a lot of progress on that front, but certainly more needs to be done, and certainly it should never be done for people. It should always be done with people. So.
Claire, thanks so much for that. I'm going to come to Hela and Payal. We're rounding the end here. Key reflections from you, or maybe something you picked up along the way that really struck you as resonant. Would be great to hear.
Everything struck me and everything resonates at the end, honestly. I find this refreshing to have a conversation from different perspectives, but really aligned minds. So it's very encouraging. I think one take from me is really, this question around security, safety and security online. We work a lot on what is happening offline. That's one of the areas that we are quite mindful of. And the introduction of technology is bringing a lot of new types of concerns from our side, especially as we are accompanying many women in their journeys of digital literacy and onboarding. The technology facilitated GBV, this conflict continuum from online to offline and vice versa. All of this is something that we're very concerned with. And we know that there are many big players also that are private sector. The ones that are creating these apps, for example, all the social media, for example, how much pressure can we put on them to ensure that they're going to be also centering some sexist content, or data privacy also comes into play. There's so much complexity there. And we still are very, very, well, I could say, we still have a lot to learn from, especially from these companies in particular. I remember one issue that happened. It's maybe a tiny anecdote, but if we try to replicate this into our context, we can see how dangerous this could be. I remember from my country, I'm Tunisian. At some point, there was an app that was downloadable from Play Store on any phone. It was an app with a game, and kids could download that. And that app was actually driving kids to suicide. It was a game that was created, and a lot of kids have downloaded that on their parents' phones because they could have access to their phones. And at some point, the parents got a bit worried because they heard about stories like that at school, of this app that they were downloading of a game that was actually extremely dangerous because it was driving to very dangerous outcomes. But that was freely downloaded, uploaded onto Play Store. So this is just one example of how can we ensure that what is available there, and what is the responsibility of those small, very, very dynamic startups that are coming out with solutions that could sometimes trigger also adverse effects, because we want to ensure that many people can have access and download it and publish content, sometimes that can be a bit harmful, that they can actually be controlled to some extent without having to, I would say, prevent them from doing their own business and pursuing their commercial, I would say, outcomes. I don't know. So in terms of ethics, there's also a lot to think of, and we need to co-create and co-think with the creators from the onset on these things. So I just wanted to give that very radical example because it kind of struck me. But That's all for me. Thanks.
Maybe I'll round out just a couple of things, observations. First, terrific conversation, Christian. Thank you for moderating a terrific discussion about really important issues and partnerships and examples. One, I think what's striking to me is there are really good examples of how to do it right, and there are good examples of how to not do it right. And so the imperative of us as an ecosystem to do better and be part of a learning agenda and have a learning, network. And Christian, I think YDEF does that. So maybe you can do a plug for that in your closing remarks. But I just think we have to do better at talking to each other and sharing the good and the bad. And in that vein, I'm hopeful that we can, convene a similar conversation and maybe go to that next click in a couple of months when we're all in New York together for UNGA, because I think, 1 hour is not enough. And I think so much about this is how we build on the work of others so that we can really accelerate impact.
Hela, Claire, thank you all so much for all of that. I would not even pretend to be able to summarize this. I will upfront apologize. I know there's some questions and comments. I don't know that we did them justice, but Joe has assured us that we'll be able to follow up with you. So we'll do our best to get you some reactions on that. And maybe, Payal, to your prompt, I would say, one of our ambitions as CARE is certainly to be more present and more engaged in this conversation and to be able to bring together more perspectives. For me, there like a couple of key takeaways were certainly there's reason for optimism. We have made some progress. We know a lot about what can work. There are some everybody problems, which can be helpful and also daunting in terms of some of the security examples that Hela just shared. Those are not unique to any one country or individual, although they all have their own flavors. There's also really clear opportunities for action. And I think some of the examples of practical near-term actions that private sector actors can take are just really valued. And I know people, I certainly appreciate being able to speak from a perspective of here's a concrete, tangible thing you can do to address that seemingly overwhelming, I think at times, challenge, and meeting people where they are, whether we call it women-centered design or human-centered design, understanding where people are, really understanding the holistic environment and their context, and then looking at how can we help them achieve their ambitions and really value wherever they are on that journey, not where our institution or a funder or a company might want them to be. And how can we do more of that? Feels like something that's also resonant. So really appreciate you all taking the time and sharing all this with everyone. And I'm going to just hand it to Joe.
Thanks, Christian. And on behalf of Concordia, thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you again to CARE, Christian, and today's amazing panel for sharing their expertise and for discussing this critical issue. We hope that you found this conversation to be insightful, and we are thrilled that you were part of it. A follow-up email will be distributed next week with a recording of today's event and the opportunity to connect with today's panel, as well as CARE to continue this discussion. Thank you again, and have a great day.